And let's take our Bibles and turn to the chapter that Jay read, just a portion of it for us from the first 6 verses out of that chapter. But as I was thinking about this chapter and just, you know, if you followed the Israelites as they were called out of Egypt, and even before that, how God led them into Egypt and then brought them out, and they're wandering around in the wilderness and all the different things that they went through and how God worked in their lives. Different miracle after miracle. The getting them out of Egypt, certainly a miracle, and then crossing the Red Sea was a miracle, and then taking care of them. Can you imagine wearing the same shoes for 40 years, same clothes for 40 years, being fed for 40 years with the same type of food, and just having something to protect you from the heat in the daytime, and when they needed to move at night, this pillar of fire by night that would lead them around, and just one miracle after the other. God worked these different miracles. Is he the same God today as he was back then? Still the same God, isn't he? And the miracles might be different, but and that's what we want to look at some this morning here, is just the situation there at Jericho. Last week we looked at chapter 5, and the thing that stands out in my mind is the encouragement as Joshua saw this person who said he was the captain of the host, and I believe again that this was the angels that he was the captain of, not Joshua's group or the enemy's group, but captain of the host. And Joshua falls down and worships him and asks what God in the flesh has to say to him. The question I think that's raised today is why something like this situation. Again, just another miracle. In my mind, it was just another miracle that God was showing himself real to these people and how he was there watching out for them and taking care of them. We're not to worship angels. In fact, Colossians chapter 2 verse 18 says, "Let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind." Not to worship angels. And so we can be confident of this, that the person that Joshua saw was not an angel. And there's some people, who want to worship and say we should worship angels. Hebrews chapter 1 and some of chapter 2, mostly chapter 1, is really clear on whether we should worship angels or not. But this wasn't an angel. I believe it was Jesus Christ himself in what we call a theophany, showing himself present there during this time. Today we see the walls of Jericho come down. And I don't know about you, but stories like this are encouraging to me, just to know that God is able to do these different kinds of things. He did it for them. And like I said, our things that we need in our life probably wouldn't be the walls falling down. I mean, I'd hate to see the church fall down. You know what I'm saying? But just the fact that God can still work miracles, maybe obviously not of the same caliber, but he's still a God working, a God of miracles. As Jericho was a city with massive walls and military strength. And I just want to read what Haley's handbook, Haley's Bible handbook has to say. It says the wall fell down flat. Dr. Garstang, and I'm not sure who he is, but found that the wall did actually fall down flat. The wall was double, two walls being 15 feet apart, the outer wall 6 feet thick, and the inner wall 12 feet thick, both being about 30 feet high. They were built not very on faulty, uneven foundations on 4-inch bricks, 4 inches thick and 1 to 2 feet long, laid in mud mortar. The two walls were linked together by houses built across the top as Rahab's house on the wall. If you remember that story, the wall was there and they had houses along there, and Rahab happened to be one of those that was on that wall. But Jericho was prepared for an attack from the Israelites, but they weren't prepared for the method of the attack. And this is what to me is really exciting and neat. The fact that they could see the Israelites lined up, the army of the Israelites out there, and the people out there, and they knew that they were out there, and they were going to be attacked. But how do you think they? I'm sure they had confidence in their wall and says, "Wow, who's going to attack? Who's going to attack us? Who can break through and get to us when you have these two walls that high and that thick?" I think they kind of laughed and thought the Israelites were pretty foolish to be out there and thinking that they could attack them and their particular city. I believe that they expected a normal attack from the Israelites, but as any army would do, but God had different plans. God doesn't always think like we do, does he? He has plans that are different than ours, and we would say, okay, well, you get your army together and you go in there and try to take the city, but God had a different plan. And this is what I think is so neat about this story, is that they didn't really do anything. God did everything. The Israelites didn't really do anything. In particular, God did the whole thing. And again, by attacking the middle of the country, which is where Jericho was, and going in from there, and then that kept the north and the south from getting together and attacking Israel as a group. So they divided them off so they couldn't have that massive attack from the north and the south together, but rather they could single out and work from that direction. And next week we see another interesting story about their attack as they progress forward from Jericho. But just by doing what they did at Jericho, it would show that God was on Israel's side. So let's join the crowd as the Israelites by faith approached Jericho. So here they were sitting there just right on the edges of Jericho, just a few miles from Jericho, and doing what God told them to do. And what was that God told them to do? He told the army to what they were supposed to do. In fact, Jay read these for us here in verses 1 through 7. Let me just kind of skim across it. It says, "Now Jericho was securely shut up because the children of Israel, none went in, none went out. And the Lord made a promise to Joshua. He said in verse 2 there, 'See, I've given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor.'" And then this is what I like about this story. In verse 3 it says, "You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall all go around the city once. This you shall do 6 days." Here they go. The military went around the city once. What a crazy bunch of people! Can you imagine being inside there, the people there in Jericho, and seeing this crazy goofball bunch of people walk around the city, not making any noise, just simply walking around the city, doing what God told them to do. But the people inside the wall, or inside of Jericho, didn't know what was happening. And so here are the Israelites walking around. Did it one day, came back to camp. Did it the next day, came back to camp. Did it the next day, came back to camp. Did it for 6 days, came back to camp each day without making any noise whatsoever. This is what God told him to do. There in verse 4, then it says, the seven priests shall bear the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. So on the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. They blew their trumpets, and in verse 5 it says, "And it shall come to pass when they make a long blast on the ram's horns, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city fell flat." So here they marched around there 6 times, 7 on the last day, and the priests blew the trumpets, and then the people all shouted, and the walls fell down. All except one particular place, and there was a reason for that. There was one house that remained that did not fall down, and that was the house that Rahab was in. You remember she hid back if you remember in early chapters there, she hid the 2 spies that went in to look out the country, and they made a promise to her, if you stay in this house, and then nothing is going to happen there to you. And she, because of her help that she had given to them. And so there they were, 7 days. Seventh day, they blew the trumpets and shouted, and the walls came tumbling down. What a is that a miracle? It sure is, isn't it? That when they all they did was just blew the trumpets and shouted, and the walls came down. You know, when one walks around by faith and he looks forward to seeing how God is going to work in his particular situation, victory was theirs from the beginning. Verse 2, again jumping back there just. And the Lord said unto Joshua, see, I have given you Jericho into your hand, as king, and those. It was a promise that God had made to them, that he was going to do this for them, and God keeps his promises. And so Joshua takes by faith his orders from God, believing that God's going to do what he says he'll do. You know, and to this day, God's never let anyone down that walks by faith. And that's the gist of this morning. The just shall live by faith. That's the way we have to live, isn't it? Each day is by faith. We have to walk our daily walk with him by faith. You know, it's kind of exciting. I'm sure Joshua didn't have any plans when he, you know, not knowing really what was going to happen. God didn't promise them when they came out of Egypt that, hey, the walls are going to fall down in Jericho, and you're going to just, you know, going to take that land, take that city. He didn't know what was going to happen, but by faith he did step by step what God told him to do. And as a result of that, God worked in his life and in the lives of his people, the Israelites. And I believe to this day, God's never let anybody down that walks by faith. Joshua relayed this to the people and then proceeded to move forward and claim the promise. The songwriter says, victory ahead. You know, we have that in our hymn book, don't we? We sing that victory ahead, and Joshua had God's promise that they were going to have victory there at Jericho. And they could have approached the city and then decided that, you know, it looks too formidable to me. There's no way we can take that city of Jericho. We've been in, we've spied it out inside there. Our 2 spies have spied it out, and when we came back with a report, you remember when they sent the 12 spies into the Promised Land, and they came back and 2 of them said, 10 of them said we can't do it, and 2 said we could with God's help. You know, the same thing here, more or less, was the same thing. The 2 went in, spied out the city, and I believe they brought back the report that, hey, with God's help, we can do it. There's no problem. But they could have said, wow, this is too much for us. I mean, you got a double-walled city that's 30 feet high, and there's no way that we can take this city. But they had God on their side. You know, it's one thing to know that we're victorious, but we need to proceed and claim the victory if we're to be blessed by God. We know we've got the victory, but if we don't proceed forward and take advantage of that and allow God to work, then we're the losers for it. So faith led them to the walls in verses 1 through 7. Faith led them around the walls in verses 8 through 19. He says there so it was, starting with verse 8, so it was when Joshua had spoken to the people that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. Okay, you see what's happening? The priests went first, and then the army, if you want to say it that way, and then they had the ark of the covenant that was there involved in this situation as well. In verse 10, now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I say to you, shout, then you shall shout. And so the ark went around, and the people, not the people, they didn't go around, but the army did, and the priest went around. And verse 12 and in verse 13, then the 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, but the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. And verse 14 says, and the second day they marched around the city, and they did that and came back, and did that and came back. And in verse 15 says, and it came to pass on the seventh day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened. What would have happened, do you think, if they'd have said, that's stupid, going around there 7 times. Let's just go 6 times. Do you remember, was it Naaman that had the leprosy, and the prophet told him, go down and dip in the Jordan River 7 times? And he said, what am I going to do that for, a dirty old river? I can go home and do that, but he did it, and on the 7th time, he came up clean as could be. They could have marched around the city 6 times and said, this is enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. It's ridiculous to go around there and not even make any noise, just go around and around and around and around and around and nothing happening. But they did what God told them, and so faith led them up to the walls. Per God's instructions, Joshua marched around the city, the army around the walls of Jericho, believing in faith that the walls would come down. Again, to the human thinking, this would be foolish, but in God doesn't always think like a person, does he? It says his ways are not our ways, and his thoughts aren't our thoughts, and he does things different than what we do, and I'm glad that he does. J. Vernon McGee made a comment on Joshua. He says, the city of Jericho is prepared. Undoubtedly, there are soldiers on the wall and watchmen at the gate. I think this is interesting. The military brass and its staff are in the city getting reports from the wall. Finally, the word comes. Here comes the enemy. Joshua and the army of Israel are marching toward the city. In front of the procession is the ark carried by the priests, and the priests carried horns. A watchman on the wall cries, here they come. Let's get ready. Then apparently, they are apparently going to attack at the gate. So the forces of Jericho gather at the gate. They are ready for the battle if the gate is broken down. Then a strange thing happens. The watchman calls, they're not going to make the attack here. They made a turn, and they're going to attack at another place. So the army inside the army on the inside shifts, and I think they march around on the inside, kind of like staying right with them. So if they make that attack, they'll be right there wherever that attack takes place. They're informed by those on the wall. There they are. They are here, and then they are here, and then they are here. Keeps moving around that city as they march around there. The Israelites go all the way around, and instead of attacking, they go back to camp. You can be sure of one thing. There's a huddle that night of the king and the military brass. Can you imagine that? Here's this goofy army marching around, didn't do a thing. Marched around again, didn't do a thing. And the inside people getting dizzy probably from going around in circles in there. And then at the end of the night say, let's get together and let's try to figure this out, what's happening. And obviously they couldn't figure it out because they didn't know what God had planned for them. I don't know. To me, it's a pretty neat situation. As the priests marched around the city, they were blowing their trumpets. Verse 9 talks about that. Imagine how the contrast, blowing of the trumpets must have caused the inhabitants of the city to wonder what crazy Israelites are trying to do. Hear this loud blast of this trumpets. And they weren't even attacking. They were just walking around blowing the horn. And blowing their horns, walking around 7 times and doing that. And then the trumpets or shofars, ram's horns, produce loud, far-reaching tones. And other than the trumpet blowing, they were all to keep absolutely silent. Verse 10. Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I say to you, shout, then you shall shout. Paul ends, another commentator says, the sound of trumpets in Joshua 6 was the announcement of blessing in the land which the Lord their God was giving them. To me it would seem like, again, the people on the inside of the wall thought the people on the outside of the wall are goofier and all get out, and to do the things that they did, not at all typical of an army and how an army would react, but yet this was God's plan for them. Verse 16, and the seventh day it happened when the priest blew the trumpet that Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Again, that promise that God had given them the city. Shout, and, well, you know the rest of the story, basically, as Paul Harvey would say. But, they could have marched around the city again and then decide that it wouldn't be worth it and quit, but they didn't. And I believe a principle that's still true today and will always be true, that don't give up. A number of years ago, Dorothy Franklin gave me a little thing that I have, a picture that I have hanging on my wall in the office there, and it's a picture of I'm assuming a stork or something similar to that, and he's trying to swallow a frog, and the frog's got his neck clamped shut so he can't swallow him, and on that thing it says, never give up. And it's really true, isn't it? If you trust God and don't give up, God's going to answer in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. Verse 16 just talks about God giving them that promise when the people shouted. And God had been trying to teach them to walk and live by faith. Walk and live by faith. Again, for us, that's what it's all about, walking and living by faith, and then seeing God answer as we do that. Boy, if you haven't walked by faith and lived by faith, you don't know what you're missing out on, and it's pretty scary. It can be pretty scary, but it's the benefits are so tremendous that it's well worth it. Romans 1:17 says, "The just shall live by faith." The Bible has a lot to say about faith, doesn't it? It says we accept Christ by faith, we're saved by faith. For by grace are you saved through faith. And if we don't have faith, then we're not pleasing to God. But faith led them up to the wall. And in verses 20 through 27, faith led them over the wall. In verses 20 through 27. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpet, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. But Joshua had said to the two men who had spied out the country, "Go into the harlot's house, and that's Rahab, if you remember that story, harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all she has, as you swore to her." And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into a treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab, the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua charged them at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city Jericho. He shall lay its foundations with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, his fame spread throughout all the country. You remember back when they were getting ready to come in, and the two spies went into the city, and you remember what Rahab said? "Man, we've heard all about you guys. We know all about you as far as what's going to happen, and we know that God is on your side. And it says their hearts melted, and they were so afraid because of God being on Joshua and the Israelites' side that their hearts melted. And here it says, so the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. Can you imagine what this must have done to some of these other cities in some of these different places when they heard what happened at Jericho, a fortress there basically on the Jordan River, and to see that it fell and crumbled without the Israelites really doing anything other than just marching around and doing what God told them to do. And there's no doubt in my mind that that word did spread pretty fast to these different places. And again, Rahab and her family were spared, and the city was plundered, and they set the remains of the city on fire, and was cursed for whoever tried to build that city again. This curse took place in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. It says, and he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemar for 2 talents of silver. Then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria, after the name of Shemar, owner of the, that was verse 24. I guess I ought to read 34 since that's what I told you, shouldn't I? In his day, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundations with Abiram, his firstborn, and with his youngest son, Shegub, he set up its gates according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. And so there's a problem there that God said, don't do that, and they went ahead and did it. And because Joshua was willing to live by faith, God richly blessed him. Verse 27, back over here in Joshua chapter 6. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. You know, they could have watched the walls come tumbling down and decided to call it quits, but they didn't. They trusted God and did what God told them to do. And God told them to do the impossible as far as from their perspective. And as a result of that, God did the rest, and they had the victory. Simple as that, sort of. J. Vernon McGee again says that Jericho represents the world to the believer. It's a strong, formidable, and can only be overcome by faith. Do you think they would have overcome Jericho if they didn't walk by faith, didn't live by faith, didn't do what God wanted them to do? They'd have never overcome Jericho. It would have been impossible for them to do that. I don't know if I read this to you already or not. Joshua J. Vernon McGee said, on the 7th day the Israelites march around the wall again. The people of Jericho heave a sigh of relief when they get clear around. The army inside the wall made its circuits too, and it's relieved that it was over for the day. Everyone sits down to rest when all of a sudden the watchman says, wait a minute, they are going to march around again. So the Israelites make the circuit again. They do it the 3rd and 4th time and on down through the 7th time. But again, Dr. Garstang found that the outer wall fell outward and down the hillside, dragging the inner wall and the houses with it, the streak of bricks continually getting thinner down the slope. Again, as God's children walk by faith, God answered and met their needs. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please God, for he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. You want to get rewards from God? There's the answer to it right there. Live by faith, walk by faith, and God will reward you for that. You know, and as we see God work on behalf of the Israelites, our faith grows. And I believe as we look at stories like this, we can see different things, how God is at work in the lives of different people, and help us to become people of faith, the people who walk by faith rather than by sight. Upon Israel's approach to the promised land, the flooded Jordan River parted. Upon Israel's entrance into the promised land, Jericho's walls collapsed. And each was a demonstration, again, that the promised land was Israel's inheritance. God had given that to them over 400 years prior to this time, and now they were just starting to get in there and take advantage of that. And God was keeping his promise to Israel by giving them the land and doing all he could to cause their families, their faith, to grow. So how does he do it? Or he does that with us too, doesn't he? Or can do that with us too as we allow him to do that. So my question for us this morning is, how's he doing in your life? Are you walking by faith? Are you trusting him? Even when things don't look very good, look pretty dark, and doesn't seem like there's any way out of the situation you're in. It's at times like that when things seem to be the darkest that God shines the most, I believe, anyhow. And so he wants us to walk by faith, to live by faith, to walk by faith, and just all these other different aspects of faith. And I hope that you're doing that you're exercising faith. I don't know what today holds, I don't know what tomorrow holds, but we know who holds the days and we know who holds tomorrow. And I just would trust and pray that you'd walk by faith. I'm the kind of guy, really, to be honest with you, I like to see the end results, even almost before it happens. I don't know if you're like that or not, but I like to see what's going to happen and go that direction. But I find at the times when you walk by faith, when I walk by faith, there's great blessing in that. I can think of when we came down here, that was by faith. And we hadn't even heard of Happy Camp until we came here. Basically, we hadn't anyhow. And, just by faith, stepping out and going, and I believe God's blessed. And if he's done it once, can he do it again? There's no doubt in my mind that he can. So let him live by faith, walk by faith, and let him bless you in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. Let's pray. Father, thank you for stories like this of how, by faith, Israel went up to Jericho, and not because of them, but because of you, and you're working in their lives, and they're allowing you to, by faith, to do those things, became victorious. And so I just pray that you would help us in our daily walk with you, that we would live by faith, that we'd walk by faith, and just allow you to work in our lives in ways that you want. And if we haven't accepted you by faith, that we need to do that first of all, otherwise we can't do the rest of it. But that door is open as well too. So work in our lives, help us, give us opportunities to trust you. And it can be scary, there's no doubt about that. But there's a blessing that comes with doing what you want us to do as we walk by faith. So thank you for these things. We pray in your name. Amen.